Well, hello everyone. This is Mark Turi, and welcome back to my channel. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for those who are watching live, and also thank you for those who are watching on the replay. As always, as I like to mention up front, if you have not liked this video yet, please give it a like. And if for any reason you haven't subscribed yet to my channel, for example, this could be the first video that you watch from me, then please go ahead and subscribe to my channel. I am still currently sitting at 1,211 subs, and I am just 500 hours away right now from getting my public watch hours up all the way to the, I guess it's the 4,000 that I need um, in order to get monetized. So I think that would be really nice if you could help me out with that. Another thing that you could help out my channel is by going to my playlists and simply watching some videos or letting the playlist run. That also helps very, very much in the calculation of public watch hours. And again, I'm very, very close to monetization, just 500 hours more. So I hope that y'all can help me out in that regard. Before we get into today's topic, which is an introduction to religious studies, based on a video that I did with the Nerdy Bunch a few years ago, I was able to actually find the PowerPoint presentation. And so, because I was able to find the PowerPoint presentation, I will do it live rather than showing you the video of the excerpt that I've been doing over the last couple of weeks. In addition to that, next week, we'll be talking about the history of Romania in the 20th century. And for that, I have also a PowerPoint on my computer. So I will be able to do a live PowerPoint presentation. And then the week after that, so the next time we meet after that in a couple of weeks, I will do a history or excuse me, a PowerPoint on the many different varieties of theologies and theological stances. And again, although I did do a video about that previously, I will do a PowerPoint like I'm doing today. So thank us again, everyone, for being here. Um, Trying to think about what I did during the week. Not terribly much again, because I will not be starting my new program yet. I have done it, had to do a gap year, so I'm just currently looking for work or something like this right now in Hungary. But I did a couple day trips, just jumped on the train and went to a couple different places. One was a small town in Slovakia, which I went on Wednesday, which is really, really nice. Slovakia is a very beautiful country, amazing countryside. Um, the language is pretty interesting. I know like some phrases, not much, but enough to get around. And I usually like going to the southern part of Slovakia, which, many years ago used to be part of Hungary, because there are many Hungarian speakers. And in this particular town that I went to, um, somewhere between one quarter are ethnic Hungarians, but about half of the people, especially I'd say 40 and older, speak Hungarian. So it was really nice to be able to, speak Hungarian with some people there, which was really great. And was able to have quite a nice time. Went to a restaurant, walked a lot. Um, a lot of these small Slovakian towns, especially in the Hungarian side, have synagogues. So I like to go see them and visit them and tour them and so forth. So that was really nice as well. And other than that, I just had a pretty good week, and hopefully be doing more within the next month or two. But so far so good. The weather today was not as bad as it had been previously, meaning not as hot, I should say. So it was not as hot. It was only in the middle 20s Celsius. And in addition to that, since it's September, again, the weather here has been pretty good. And not too much else from last week. Really, just heading to this little Slovakian town, which I think was really pretty and really nice. And that's about all really for today. Um, Today's presentation, as I mentioned before, is an introduction to religious studies. And this is a presentation and a PowerPoint that I, as I mentioned earlier, gave to the Nerdy Bunch a couple of years ago. But um, I've added a slide, took away one slide, added one slide, and I really think it's interesting information because to sort of give a background on why I'm interested, in this topic was when I had left Scientology in May of 2005. I started to read a lot about religion and religious studies because there were definitely books and people, especially online and videos, that were more skeptical of religion and so forth. And I had also been through a number of different religions in the past, even before Scientology. Just want to say hello to Shell. Shell, thank you so much for being here. It's great to see you. Welcome, and I hope you're well. Please let me know how you're doing, of course, in the chat. So very much a pleasure for you for you to be here. It's a pleasure of mine for you to be here. That sounded too arrogant, even though I am, you know, that. I'm well and good to see you too. Thank you, Shell. Thank you so much, Shell. Um, so I was saying, I had gone and had some experiences, good and bad, in some religions before I had joined Scientology. So I joined when I was 22. So when I was 18, and I started to get a little bit more independence. I had a used car, and so if I was interested in a religion or a group, I actually, could go and drive. And I grew up in a suburb of Toronto, which is it might have taken anywhere from half an hour to an hour to get to certain places downtown, or I took public transit or whatever. Um, and basically, I had a mixed bag of positive and negative experiences. And so when you leave a group like Scientology, you're still looking for answers, which is what we're all doing. And, certain, let's call them anti-religion or, you know, groups were obviously quite accessible online, but then so were religious groups. And I didn't really want to get sucked into another group. So it helped me, religious studies and the academic study of religion helped me kind of make sense of things. And if you've been on my channel for, a little bit long, long or longish or whatever, you'll know that one of my motivations for why I do this is for education purposes. And my philosophy on this stuff is like religion in general is obviously a very taboo and can be a very controversial subject. And so, what I tell people that have had mostly negative experiences, which may have led you to not be religious, is I'm talking here now about a secular study, academic study, which takes into account those more negative social, communal, personal aspects of religions, but there are also positive benefits, whether it's individual, communal, or societal. And so, we're going to be looking at some stuff here, and it is for the purpose of education. And it's not obviously to support or negate anyone's personal experience, it's just to broaden it a bit more. The other thing I remember when I was leaving Scientology was I had a lot of fear. I was scared a lot and I was very angry, and one of the things that I found was that the more I learned, the more curious I was about the world and different things. And the more that I was cut off from it, the more angrier and isolated I got. And I think with religion, you don't have to love it. You don't have to be a part of it. You don't even have to think it's a good thing, but it exists. It's in our society. And there has to be some level of contentness, whether that's from religious groups, and some of them can't live and let live, which I'm against, but that there is an aspect of like, okay, well, you as an individual don't necessarily have to be a part of it, but it's still part of society. And so the whole thing with this whole education thing that I'm trying to do is to alleviate fear, and it's to sort of gain knowledge. So that's kind of my preface before we start. And again, it's not to negate anyone's personal experience. I'm not here as an apologist, which is another thing. I know that many ex-members of Scientology are kind of traumatized by a lot of religious scholarship because the Church of Scientology has gone out and literally hired and paid religious scholars with, in some cases, with PhDs from very prominent universities to just talk about fluff with them. And they've created the term new religious movement and so forth. And I will say one of the things I think which is a bit of a deficit, not just in modern psychology and counseling, but also in religious studies, is trying to take some of these things that we talk about in the Scientology critic movement, some of the critiques of the Church of Scientology, such as the abuses and so forth, because often they are dismissed by certain religious scholars, people like J. Gordon Melton and others, who wrote a small book on Scientology that I read before I joined Scientology, which just dismissed all of the criticism. And that's not good either. So this is where we're going to start today. That's sort of my preface on that. And let's go to my slides. So I hope this is informative. If anyone is here who's at the live chat, what I do for these PowerPoints is I have to enlarge, I have to put, my slides into full screen mode, which means I don't always get to look at my chat. There's something with StreamYard about that. So what I do is I will, talk about a slide or two, but please put any questions, any comments, any concerns, any thoughts you have, anything that you have, please put them into the live comments. And then if you're watching this on the replay, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, thoughts, please put them in the comments section. But before I do that, I want to say hello to my buddy Clearwater Chad. Thank you, Chad, for being here. Very much appreciated. And I am going to message you this week or next week about a Pete Griff showdown, which we can do on both our channels because it is needed. And yeah, hello again to Shell. And yeah, absolutely. So I will, please, Chad, look out for that. I'll message you on Facebook because I still want to do some funny humor stuff and we'll figure it out. Okay, so my slides will go up right now, Introduction to Religious Studies, and I'm going to enter my full screen mode. So in a minute or two, I'll go back to see if there's anything, but please again, please just let me know again, questions, comments, concerns, whatever, please in the live chat. So here we go. So today, this week, we are talking about an introduction to religious studies and a base overview of the basics. And one of the other things that I didn't mention earlier that sort of starts off our discussion here with this presentation is I moved to Los Angeles, California in January of 2009. So less than a year after leaving Scientology, and I went to community college and I took a couple classes on religion. One was a philosophy class, and a lot of the stuff that we learned in the philosophy of religion kind of overlaps a little bit into the introduction of religious studies. I also was able to many years ago go on to anybody remember iTunes U? So iTunes had this little thing called iTunes U, which meant university. And I remember that there were two specific um, lecture series actually from one was a university I think in the Midwest. The other one was somewhere in the Western United States, and one was from a community college actually in Nevada, Reno, I think, and the second was maybe somewhere in Missouri at a university. And some professors, instructor had, I guess, like a 15 or 16 lectures that they filmed. One was actually filmed in the class live, and another one was just filmed independently. And I remember learning a heck of a lot about religious studies from there. And that would have been at least 25, 26 lectures. This has got to be now 15 plus years ago, maybe closer to 20. But regardless, I became very interested and I did a lot of research and a lot of studying. So let's start. Well, we got to start with the history of religious studies. And this is what's really, really interesting because the first person, or at least the first academic to talk about an academic study of religion, which then develops into a modern academic subject and faculty of religious studies, was a gentleman named Friedrich Max Müller. He was, of course, a German scholar, and he sort of introduced the topic in a book that he published that was based on his lecture notes, and that book was called The Introduction to the Science of Religion. It was printed in 1870, and again, he was a university lecturer. So university lecturers obviously have notes, like we have PowerPoint now, but all of his lecture notes were published, and he's one of the first people to really start off this academic research. And this is also a very similar time, 1870 in Germany, especially when like psychology, sociology is also starting to come into academia. Um, so there's these new fields, and one of which is religious studies. And of course, the science of religion today sounds a little odd. It might sound like a bit of a pseudoscience religious group that believes, that they have a science, almost like Scientology believes it. Yeah, it's not a term we use anymore, but that was what it was referred to, before. The other thing that I think is interesting is while the word religion, religious, etc., while that word or those words have, they go back to Latin and they have maybe some Latin Greek roots and so forth, really, and this is sort of the first point of religious studies, is the idea when we think of like all the different world religions, which I will get into later, but I'll, obviously go through now, like Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Taoism, Shinto, Confucianism, Sikhism, etc., etc., etc. A lot of that ideas, those groups existed before, the 18th century or the 19th century, but to have all of them together as if they were one subject is actually maybe 150 years old. And so in like reality, and especially outside of the West, there are world religions like in Buddhism, especially in the East, where some people don't even consider that to be a religion, and some people might not even consider other religions to be religions. For example, I have a few friends from China who are students in Hungary, and I've asked them, I've said, like, there's something called Chinese folk religion, which we can get to in a moment, which combines Buddhism, Confucianism, and Taoism. And they'll say, no, that's not religion, that's culture. I've talked before about in Japan how they have Shinto and Buddhism, which is often combined into Japanese folk religion, but it's not really seen the same way as how Christianity is seen in Europe or in North America or South America. And so our sort of Western perspective of religion is influenced by our culture, by our education, and by our personal experience. And so all of those things together combine, and this is sort of what religious studies is, you know, noted for, and what they're trying to sort of get at. So that's always the first kind of lesson. Is the only reason we think of Hinduism and, you know, Judaism or Islam and, Shintoism. All of that was because in the West, European scholars put all of those groups together. There's not much evidence prior to this, so prior to the 19th century, that Christians, if Christian priests, like Catholic priests or missionaries, were trying to convert people on the Silk Road, they might have gone, to Asia at some point. They wouldn't really look at Buddhism and be like, oh, well, that's religion and we're religion too. And it's the same if Buddhist monks or missionaries were, going westward. Like there just wasn't the idea of, well, that's a religion and this is a world religion. That's a new concept. So I sort of wanted to start there. That when we're thinking about religion, religious studies really asks us to think of religion differently. And again, it sort of starts here with Friedrich Max Müller and many scholars who put all of these religions together, and why they did that was they wanted to compare it to Christianity. And this is where there is a sort of a problematic starting point. But before we get into some of the issues, we sort of have to get into like what is religious studies? What does it mean when we talk about it? Uh, what is it? Why do we have it? What's going on in it? And why is it an academic subject, for example? Now, the source I have in this is on Wikipedia, which is not an academic source. However, does give the best overview. So, what is religious studies? Religious studies, also known as the study of religion, is an academic field devoted to research into religious beliefs, behaviors, and institutions. It describes, compares, interprets, and explains religion, emphasizing systemic, historically based, and cross cultural perspectives. So, already, what that means is the older religious scholars comparing it to Christianity, which is what the term religion really means. It starts off with the idea that all of these other religions, like Hinduism and so forth, have something in common with Christianity and they can have certain things that are in common. But in the modern world and in modern academia, we're trying to broaden that and make it more what's called holistic. So we're not just looking at Christianity, what makes Christianity tick, taking another religion coming in and looking to how it compares to Christianity, but we have to look at things like history and culture and systems, traditions, and so forth. Now I have a photo here on the right of some religious symbols. I'll just go through them very briefly because this represent a lot of what we think when we think about the world's religions or world religions. So from the upper left third, there's of course three rows. So the first row, we have the Star of David, Judaism. The next is a star, which is of the Baha'i faith. That's a religion from Iran. The next in the middle is a Chinese character. That is the symbol of the Confucius religion from China. The fourth is called native. It's a representative symbol of the what we might call Native American, First Nations, or the indigenous spiritual traditions of North and South America. Some people would say that's a religion, some people wouldn't, which is quite interesting. The fifth character here is Islam. This is the crescent moon and star. That is their symbol. Going to the second row, we have Sikhism. This is, of course, a religion from India, from northern India, from Punjab. Next to that is the yin yang of Taoism or Taoism of China. In the middle is Wicca, which is actually considered a new religion that is based on the principles of paganism, neo paganism, and so forth. The fourth symbol is a almost like a doorway. You have to forgive me if that's not exactly what it is, but it's sort of a passing point in Shinto. So this is a religion of Japan amongst the Japanese people. The fifth one is the cross of the Eastern Orthodox Church, and you can see, unlike the cross below it in other Christian crosses, it has a small cross above, and then it has an inverted um, line in the middle there. Starting from the bottom row, we have the Om symbol. That means Om, I believe, in Sanskrit, and that's the symbol of Hinduism. Next to that is the Wheel of Dharma from Buddhism. In the middle is the Roman religion. So that was, of course, the Roman pagan religion of Saturn, Mars, and so forth. The fourth one is, in general, paganism. And then finally, Catholicism, which, of course, is a cross with the circle. Before I get to that, I just want to see if there's any other comments. Oh, hey, Irish Mart. How are you, Irish? I'm just, as I just started, of course. Really, really good to see you. It was awesome to see you protesting in Dublin. That was really, really cool. I have a few questions. I'm going to um, see how I can message you about that, just about the location of the church. But I'm very interested in that, so I appreciate that. Oh, next weekend out of town, but okay, after that, that's fine. That's fine, Chad. And yes, it's good to see you, Irishmart. Thank you so much for being here. It's always good to see you. I love your protest videos. As I said, I just have a couple of logistics questions about the org has nothing to do with you, just more the location of the org. In that, I mean, they're not personal questions. I'm not asking you where you live. I just want to know where where the org actually is. Anyway, I digress. So let me go back to my slides here. Um, so then what is religious studies? Well, again, we're going to talk about in this slide, we're going to talk about what it is. And the next slide, we're going to talk about what it isn't. So when we talk about religious studies, again, what are we talking about? Well, the first thing is whenever we have a studies within an academic subject. For example, I just received my master's in Central European Studies. There's also Hispanic and Latin American Studies, African American Studies, Hungarian Studies, English Studies, so forth. These are humanities subjects. So religious studies is a humanities subject, but it doesn't just um, interact with other, humanities subjects. It is, in some cases, what's called interdisciplinary because when we look at religious studies, it is interested in other humanities subjects and in humanities in general. So we talk about one of mine, of course, which is history. I have a BA in history and an honors degree in history, and the Central European Studies has a lot of history. And of course, I wrote a historical thesis. So we like to know, for example, when it comes to the world's religions, how old are they? When did they develop? Maybe if they have a founder, so forth, like that. Philosophy is a big one too. I mentioned I took a philosophy of religion course in the United States in a community college in Los Angeles. And the philosophy of religion deals with examining the questions that religious groups or religions in general are trying to answer or believe that they do have answers for. So, is there a God? What happens after we die? Do we have a purpose in life? And so forth. A lot of metaphysical questions, but a lot of them, or even theological questions. And a lot of them are studied, not always answered, but studied by individual religious groups, individual religious people, and so forth. So, religious studies is at least interested in humanities, but not just humanities. We have the social sciences, and these are very, very important to religious studies. So, for example, there is a sociology of religion. I mentioned before that in like the late 19th century, sociology, especially in Germany, was becoming a very active academic subject on universities. And one of its founding fathers of modern sociology was a gentleman named Max Weber. And he wrote a book called The Sociology of Religion. And he took what is called a functional approach or a functionalist approach to religion, which believes that religion has a function in our society, whether positive or negative. It has to have a function. It does have a function. Karl Marx believed that religion was a source of conflict between the classes. And the final uh, founding father, or one of the most major founding fathers of sociology, was a French French sociologist named Emile Durkheim, who believed in symbolism, that religions gave people to symbols to have meaning in their life, to fight for, and so forth. So some kind of conflict of the functionalists, the symbolists, and the conflictists or the conflict people, and that's sort of their contributions, at least in the early times. And of course, today many sociologists will look at what are the positive and what are the negative aspects of religion in our society. We then go to another social science of psychology. This could include social psychology, but why are people religious? Is religion good for the brain and human behavior, etc.? And then anthropology, of course, is the study of civilization. They'll look at things like traditions, rituals, and so forth, funerals, weddings. And then archaeology, of course, we know archaeology. It's those who will go out to a site and they will dig up the remains of civilizations and people and ruins. And we can maybe trace how long religions and other spiritual traditions have been on Earth because of those findings. Religious studies is also interested in studying religious texts. So if you enjoy reading Bible, Quran, the Dharmapada, the Bhagavad Gita, the Torah, and various other religious texts, which there are many, many of, maybe religious studies is something that might suit you. If you enjoy visiting places of worship, which I really do, one of the things I loved about growing up in Toronto was there was a massive variety of temples, mosques, synagogues, mandirs, masjids, centers, etc., of all, most of the world's religions. And so many of them were open to the public, and they were, quite interesting to go to open houses and so forth. And then also interviewing religious people. I mean, we can sort of foo-foo, oh, religious people, dismiss them, but we have our own, in some cases, cultures, personal experiences, and so forth. And why does somebody join Scientology? I mean, I've contributed to that in some small way. Religious scholars, for example, may look at our videos of all ex-Scientologists, and whether it's right now or in the future, and I hope that they sort of correct some of the apologetics that some scholars have been doing in favor of the Church of Scientology. So, my story and other people's stories can get out there, and it is a negative one in many cases, and they need to be addressed and taken seriously, which in the past, not necessarily all scholars have done. Another important point is that one does not need to be religious or even have a religious affiliation in order to study religious studies. You're simply, this is a secular academic study. So this is not something that requires, a faith or an affiliation. So I have known atheists who have been interested in religious studies. And I like to say, well, why not? I mean, we sometimes tend to think of people who are atheists as anti God or anti religion, but that's not always the case. And we also sometimes think of Christians or Jews or people that have one religious affiliation as maybe being, not welcoming to others. But that's not necessarily the case, too, because if someone is studying religion, they're doing it in a secular way, and they're combining these humanities and these social sciences, and they're combining some of these interests that are listed here. Excuse me. So now we go on to what religious studies is not. And this is also quite important, because I know when some people think, oh, you're majoring religious studies, do you want to be a priest? Do you want to be a rabbi, an imam, or something, or a minister, a reverend, etc.? Well, religious studies is not the same as studying theology or divinity studies. Those are two things that are very similar. In those you're studying the nature of God, and you're looking at philosophy and religious texts and stuff, but specifically to study God. And I know people might be thinking, hey, we're talking about religious studies. Of course, they talk about God, but theology is specifically talking about that subject. Religion is more, as I said, going holistically. We're studying culture, we're studying traditions, we're studying the impacts on society, we're studying sort of everything else around it. Of course, God is a part of it, but it's not the part of it. It's more holistic religious studies. Theology and divinity studies, you're studying God, you're studying the nature of God. Okay, and that's exactly what I have here. It is not the study of God, nor does it study the nature of God. That is theology, that is divinity studies. Now, people who study theology and divinity studies may, although not always, but they may go on to become a clergy person. So, as I've written here, a degree in religious studies does not make one qualified to be ordained within a religious organization. Of course, there are probably many people who go to theology school, which or divinity school, which normally is a graduate program, usually a master's program. Of course, you could take religious studies as your BA in a 4 year or 3 year if you're in Europe or other places. And then you could go on to do your master's degree in theology. But some people choose psychology, sociology, history. So you don't have to, is what I'm saying. So you can, obviously, if you're studying to be, a Catholic priest or minister. And I'll also remind an example here. So growing up in Toronto, we have the University of Toronto, and although I forget the name of the colleges, you'll have to forgive me. There is a Catholic college at the University of Toronto that has a divinity school, and there is an, I believe, an Anglican school. There might be one for the United Church, but there's a Catholic and an Anglican school, and they have divinity studies and theology master's degrees. Now, of course, the University of Toronto also has a religious studies faculty, but it's separate. So let's say someone wants to go to the priesthood or they want to become a minister. As I said, that first step as a BA, that you can pretty much choose from most any other subjects. But if you do want to be ordained, then you'd go to theology. What a religious studies degree might go into, so if you do religious studies as a BA, then you move on to a master's and a PhD, you can become a religious scholar. And a religious scholar will do a variety of different works and so forth that have nothing to necessarily do with clergy. And again, you may or may not even have a religious affiliation or be personally religious yourself. So it's a very interesting, kind of well-rounded societal aspect of what religion is, rather than just specifically focusing on God. Let me just see in our comments here. Yeah, again, Irish. Good to see you. And good to see you, Shell. Okay, here's a couple interesting things that we divide religion into when it becomes what are called dichotomies. There's three different dichotomies in religion, and the first dichotomy is taking a look at how we can separate within religions, because once we understand, okay, we have these world religions, but how do they differ? Because the first really lesson is that they're not all the same. They don't really have the same beliefs or traditions in many religions. There will be some commonalities, but how do they also differ? So one of these dichotomies is to look at their view on proselytization. Now, when I talk about these two things, also remember that there's always going to be a third option, which I'm going to bring up in a moment. But let's go back to the original dichotomy here, the basic differences in religion. On the photo here on the left, I have the term above it, I have the term universalizing religion. And the photo in this is a photograph of two LDS, so Latter day Saints Mormon missionaries who are in Africa, and they are speaking with a young woman and her child, and they are proselytizing. So when we think of a universalizing religion, think proselytization, think missionaries. Why is it called universalizing? A universalizing religion, like most forms of Christianity, I will give you an exception, but most forms of Christianity, whether it's the LDS Church, Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, Catholics, and Protestants, among some others, they have had a lot of success, whether we, like it or not. And I obviously think a lot of us have some problems with it, especially during colonial times. But they have had a lot of success going from Europe to Africa, North and South America, Asia, Australia with missionaries and converting people, because specifically to Christianity, they will have a gospel, a set of stories, or a mission about Jesus specifically, which transcends things like language, culture, in some cases, education background, and even gender. So, this is why it's called universalizing, because the Bible, for example, translated into what, hundreds, thousands of languages. There's Christian churches, as I mentioned, on every continent in the world. Um, the most amount of human beings on the planet are Christians, which as we're going to get into next slide, and they've been very successful in proselytizing, meaning looking for converts. Now, on the next side here, the next opposing force category is called an ethnic or an ethno religion. The photo in this photo is of five individuals who are praying over fire, and these individuals belong to a very old religion called Zoroastrianism, which was at one point a very large religion in Iran, and especially of the Persian Empire. And of course, once Islam came, most converted to Islam. So, in this group of religions, to which I have a slide after, where I get more specific, you must be born into this religion. And so things like connect a connected history to one group of people, um, set of traditions, cultures, even language are connected. That's what an ethnicity means. Ethnicity is a group of people that have these shared commonalities, shared language, shared history, shared culture, shared traditions. Universal does not. Okay, universal, you can be, ethnically Irish or ethnically, Colombian or ethnically indigenous to Australia, and you can be a Christian. But in ethno religions, the difference here is you're born into it, and in some religions like Zoroastrianism, if you are born to a Zoroastrian mother, you are Zoroastrian, but there are no ways to convert. So they do not proselytize. They're still a religion, but they don't proselytize and they don't seek out members. The opposite of that would be a group like Judaism, where in my religion in Judaism, if one is born to a Jewish mother, you are considered Jewish, but there is a conversion process. Usually, people they try to deter one from that. Traditionally, rabbis would try to dissuade a potential convert, and they would actually have to go to a court 3 times before they were even allowed to convert. Today, mostly, if you're going to marry someone who's Jewish or something, there's some leeway, especially in the Reform and the conservative traditions. But in the Orthodox tradition, again, they don't really proselytize. We don't really look for new members. You kind of have to come to us, and then you might be dissuaded, as opposed to Mormons, whom I actually saw a group of Mormon missionaries maybe a month ago, and they came up to me, and I sort of just said, no, thank you, and walked away. But, they would help people want to convert. You could basically do that. So that's a big difference between proselytization and non-proselytization. And here's some examples. And here we're going to get into some exceptions because the thing about a dichotomy is, in order for not to be a false dichotomy, there must be a third option. If it's a really true dichotomy, then it has these two halves. So we have one half, which is the universalizing, the missionaries, and the proselytization. We have the ethno religions that you have to be born into. Maybe you can convert, maybe you can't. And again, even within religions, there are some differences and there are some exceptions. But first of all, for universalizing religions, they happen to have the most people on earth. And the biggest ones are Buddhism. There's an asterisk, however, which I didn't put on put in this, but there is an asterisk. Today, Buddhism has around 470 million followers all over the world. When Buddhism began with Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, Buddhism spread from modern day Nepal into India, um, Pakistan, modern day Pakistan, and Afghanistan, Mongolia, China, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, Sri Lanka, and I'm probably missing some, but so on, Myanmar, etc. Now, how did it do that? Well, it did that with Buddhist missionaries and monks. So today, it's mostly taboo for Buddhists to proselytize. They've made most like mainstream Buddhist groups have taken kind of a step back on that, but historically they have been very much into proselytization. And the groups that do proselytize, such as the Soka Gakkai International, which is a Japanese Buddhist group that does proselytize, most Buddhists will consider that to be a bit unorthodox, even heretical, and they might even consider those groups to be a cult. Today, Theravada Buddhism is kind of like a sort of like a national religion, not really an ethnic religion, but a national religion, which kind of toes the line. So if you're born in Thailand, you're Thai, you're most likely Theravada Buddhist, same in Sri Lanka, same in Myanmar, and so forth. So there are some countries, especially in the Theravada tradition, where like most Sinhalese people are ethnically Sinhalese who come from, Sinhalese from Sri Lanka are most likely Buddhists. Now, of course, there's Christians and there are ethnic Tamils who are Muslim, but it's like it's a national religion. We're also going to see that next in Christianity, which is the largest religion in the world, 2.6 billion human beings, around 31, 32% of the whole world's population. So, whereas I mentioned that Catholicism, Protestantism, and other groups like the Mormons and the Jehovah's Witnesses do proselytize, the Eastern and the Oriental Orthodox churches really don't. So they're kind of in the middle and they're more like national churches. So you think of the Greek Orthodox Church, Bulgarian, Macedonian, Serbian, Romanian, Russian, Belarusian, Ukrainian, Georgian, and then Armenian, which is Oriental, and Ethiopian, which is Oriental. A lot of these groups also, when they were part of the Byzantine Church, they did have missionaries, two of the most famous ones, Saint Cyril and Saint Methodius, who attempted to convert Turkic groups and also the Moravians, which they didn't do. Also started an alphabet, which then got reformed and became the Cyrillic alphabet, named after Saint Cyril. They did proselytization back, in like the ninth century or whatever. But after the Great Schism of the 12th century and so on, most of those Eastern and Oriental Orthodox churches have towed that line where, if you're not Greek and you join a Greek Orthodox church, you kind of got to know Greek. You kind of have to have Greek culture. So again, it's not an ethnic religion, but it's more of a national church and a national religion which will toe this line. And this is why I'm giving these third examples because everything is not all cut and dry. After this, we have Islam. Islam is, of course, the second most um, populated religion on planet Earth at 1.8 billion, around a quarter of people. And then, of course, they have Sunnis. Sunnis are pretty quintessentially universalizing. Um, Sunni Muslims are the majority denomination mostly throughout the Middle East, Central West Asia, South Asia, Africa, parts of Europe like Bosnia and Albania, lots in Russia, for example, and even in places like Indonesia and Malaysia. But there's also Shiite Islam, and there is a group called the Ismailis. And I know about this group because there's quite a lot of them in Canada, and I grew up with a lot of them. They are considered, again, kind of like an ethno denomination. They are considered Muslim, although they are considered to be very unorthodox. I remember having friends growing up in elementary school, and they had pictures of a gentleman called the Aga Khan, who was their spiritual leader. I sort of tried to ask my friends what were their beliefs were. They were kind of secretive about it. They had their first life within Shia Islam, I believe, in the Middle East. There was also quite a number in Pakistan, and then a lot under British colonial times moved to East Africa. So many of my friends, although their grandparents and great grandparents were from Pakistan, many of their parents were born in Tanzania, and then in the 1970s there was a revolution, and the Indo-Tanzanians, so the Tanzanians of Indian descent, quote unquote, and Pakistani descent, fled to Canada. So this is where again we have like these exceptions. Now, if we look at what an ethnic religion is, ethnic religions have the fewest because they don't look for converts, but there is Hinduism. Hinduism is technically an ethnic religion because for the first part is that they most Hindu groups, and I know there's a massive diversity since there are 1.2 billion Hindus in the world, a lot. So there's a lot of diversity. So I'm speaking here in kind of a generality, maybe of a more liberal interpretation of Hinduism. But in Hinduism, the idea of proselytization, it doesn't really match with their own belief because many Hindus believe that as human beings, we already have a piece of the divine within us. And as long as we sort of follow what I said, the laws of karma, or as long as we sort of do good, when we reincarnate, we can reincarnate and come back as a better, or different type of being. And so, punishment and reward, you don't really have to be Hindu in order to do that. So for them, they're not out to save your soul, like let's say in Christianity and parts of Islam, or the salvation is like a huge thing. For Hindus, salvation is kind of like universal. And there are, of course, again, groups that do proselytize in Hinduism. One of the most recognizable is the Hare Krishnas, and also a group called the Brahmin Kumaris, I think is the name. Regardless, they are the exception, so they're looked at as heretical and unorthodox. But in general, you don't necessarily have to convert. Next is Judaism, 15 million people. I know a lot of people get surprised. They think there's a lot more Jews in the world. There's 15 million of us. There's, more people in Istanbul and the province of Ontario, the state of Texas, than there are Jews in the entire world. It's a relatively small population. About half of us live in America. Roughly half live in Israel, and about 1 million, I should say 7 million America, 7 million Israel, 1 million elsewhere. And as I mentioned, in Judaism, you can convert. There are people who have converted, whether they've married someone who is Jewish or not, doesn't really matter. Um, but you can. There is a process. It's a lengthy process. You'll be dissuaded from it. You have to study a lot. And when you convert, you really have to follow the rules. Whereas someone who's born into Judaism, they can kind of get away with not following the rules. But if you do convert, the idea is you've made a covenant with God and you are going to keep kosher and you're going to celebrate Shabbat and so forth. But we don't really go looking um, for new converts. There's one group in within Judaism, it's a Hasidic movement called the Chabad Lubavitch. And what they do is they do community outreach to what they call non-observant Jews. So Jews that aren't Orthodox. So Reformed Jews, secular Jews, non-religious Jews, conservative Jews, etc. And they try to make them become more observant. And there's a debate on whether or not they're proselytizing. So if I proselytize to other Jews to make them more observant, am I proselytizing? And it's of course who knows? It's obviously a philosophical debate. And then we're going to round the next three. So we have a combination of what we might call paganism, folk religion, animism, shamanism, spiritual traditions of the indigenous peoples over all of the continents of the world. There's around 600 million. They are considered ethno religions. The aforementioned Roman religion was the ethnic religion of the Roman people. Greek religion was Zeus. That's their ethnic religion of the Greek people. And then Shinto, 3 million, that is the ethnic religion of the Japanese people. And because I mentioned Zoroastrianism, there's about 120,000 Zoroastrians in the world today. It is small because they were once a very powerful ethnic religion, especially with the Persian Empire. But since Islam, they have quite a relatively small population. I just want to come back here and just say, hey there, Peter, Peter Anderson, number 4. Good to see you. Don't worry, better late than never, as they say. Hey, Irish, how are you again? So you got Irish, Chad, Pete, Shell. Amazing. Absolutely amazing. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And then Pete, you said we have a Sikh group in my area. They're often confused as being Muslim. Well, that was one of the things after 9/11 was I think the first casualty of 9/11 was a Sikh man who I think was killed, and I don't know if it was in Canada or in America. Also, um, Hindu temples, mosques, and Sikh temples, which are called gurdwaras, were heavily, heavily graffitied and defaced all over the United States and Canada post 9/11. Not understanding that the three of them are different groups is a whole other thing of ignorance, but it was really disgusting. Sikhism is also technically an ethnic religion. of the Punjabi people. It started, I believe, in the 15th century by a gentleman named Guru Nanak, and there are 10 gurus. And some people believe that it was a way to synthesize and compromise between Islam and Hinduism. It's obviously not exactly like that, but for example, unlike Hindus, they do believe in one God, and but they definitely have a lot of like Indian sort of Hindu sort of tradition because that's where they come from, and it's a really really interesting faith. I've always liked to go see. In northern India, they have something called the Golden Temple, and I've always wanted to see that. Let's move on. Another part of this dichotomy we're going to look into today is the difference between theistic and non theistic religions. So, what does religion say about God or gods? Now, I know this is going to sound a little odd, and I understand if you grow up in America, if you've grown up in a Christian nation, you might say religion and God are the same. In the English language, religious scholars will say the only purely religious word in the English language is God because groups like words like faith, prayer, salvation, they have secular meanings, right? Like, worship. You can worship God, but you can worship, technology. Examples of that, right? But that's us, that's our culture, and so there are groups called non-theistic religions. Last week we talked about them on the video. Means that they do not espouse a belief in God, and we did go over some of them last week. But just to clarify, a religion that is theistic or theocentric means that there is an espoused belief in a god or many gods. And we talked also, and we'll talk in 2 weeks from now about monotheism, polytheism, and all that stuff, which I will do slides like this for, and we'll get into more of those. But generally, when we talk about theistic religions, we're referring to Christianity, Hinduism, Islam, Judaism, Sikhism, Zoroastrianism. There are others, of course, like the Baha'i Faith and other groups, Shinto, for example, and so forth, but these are just some examples. Non theistic religions would be Buddhism, probably specifically Theravada Buddhism, also Confucianism, Dao or Taoism. They're both obviously the same, spelled with a D or a T, the Ethical Culture Society, Jainism, and the Unitarian Universalist Association. Both ethical culture and Unitarian Universalism are religious humanism. They are considered non theistic religions. And all this really means is that they focus on something else other than God. There may be some gods, like in Buddhism, there are these beings called devas, and as the legend and teachings in Buddhism go, when Buddha was under the Bodhi tree meditating, before he gained enlightenment, he actually was able to, I guess we might say, travel, soul travel, if that's the word, or he visited different dimensions, different heavens and hells, and according to Buddhism, and I might be paraphrasing a little bit, he was able to meet with different quote unquote gods, which are called devas, and what the Devas actually told the Buddha, which was different from Hinduism, is that the Devas, or these quote unquote gods, were mortal and they were imperfect. And if Buddha wanted to obtain enlightenment, they were not important. Okay. So that means Buddhism is about enlightenment, not about God, it's about enlightenment. Confucianism is like, as I mentioned last week, it's a set of laws and traditions. Taoism has the Tao, which is like you could compare it to the Force in Star Wars, but that's not exactly it. Ethical culture and the Unitarians, you can believe in God if you want, but they're more focused on humanity and humanism. And then Jainism, you kind of become a god, which I will talk about in a couple of weeks, called autotheism, regardless. And some Buddhist traditions are like that too. Regardless, they don't espouse a belief in God. There's no, they're about something else. And again, I know that's odd for quote unquote Western people to sort of think about because our religions, specifically Christianity, Catholicism, and Protestantism, is very God based. And through that, you may have the Trinity, God, the Son, the Holy Spirit, that's three parts of one in in some traditions, or they're all considered separate if you're Protestant. But regardless, the fundamental core is that belief, but it isn't in these other religions. So God as a concept, or gods as a concept, is not the overarching or arcing idea of religion either. And so this is where things get more complicated. Another one is faith-based versus practice-based. So we have universalizing. Do they proselytize? Ethnic. Are you born into it? Maybe you can convert, maybe you can't. Then we have, again, going back, is God espoused? Is God not espoused? Well, the next, part is, are we faith-based? In the United States of America, as a mostly Protestant nation, generally speaking, most, especially evangelical Protestants, which can be part of different denominations, Baptists, Presbyterians, Lutherans, Pentecostals, etc. But most evangelical Christians are a faith first faith or a faith first religion. In that case, most churches in Protestantism, a lot of them, and the majority of them in America, will say you are saved by faith alone. Going back to John 3:16, I'm not going to quote it, but it says if you believe in Jesus, you are given eternal life. So it's faith based. You believe, you have an honest, pure belief, you go to heaven. But we also have practice based religions. And so in my photos, under faith based is a group of evangelicals in the United States at an evangelical megachurch service, which there are many of in the US, especially throughout the entire US, the South, the Midwest, the West, etc. And then on the right, under practice based, we have a Buddhist monk with a Buddhist service. Some religions are less about faith and belief and more about practice. So in Judaism, we have a lot of traditions. We focus more on those traditions than we do on our beliefs, which is why in different Jewish circles, you can be an atheist, an agnostic, a deist, or whatever, and still be Jewish, even if you just practice the high holidays. Or there are some atheists who actually might go to a Reform synagogue or a more liberal based synagogue every Shabbat. And it might seem odd to us, but it's because the traditions matter most. Yes, those traditions and some of our prayers, which we recite, the word God is used, but it's more historical, right? It's because those traditions have been spoken, those prayers have been said for thousands of years. And so just repeating the word God, which we would say Adonai or Adonai Eloheinu, or Adonai Eloheinu, is not necessarily against someone being an atheist because you're focused more on the traditions. Now, in evangelical Christianity, you might have a problem, but it's not if you're practice based. I mentioned before the Ethical Culture Society, the Unitarians, religious humanism is more practice based because they don't care what you believe in the sense of God. There are people who believe, there are people who don't believe, there are people who just don't know, they're questioning, whatever. But they have taken a kind of social justice approach and a humanity focus to religion. So their practice has to do with like activism and things like this. Although in services, they do light candles or have some kind of rituals and they do have worship services and so forth like that. So there's still religion, but they'll take different approaches to their practice, whether it is like a prayer, a tradition, meditation, or something like this, rather than this mega church, which will combine a lot of prayer and a lot of faith and a lot of zealousness with maybe some music and some sermons and so forth. So this is another divide. I also want to let you know, of course, that there are churches Lutherans, Methodists, many non-evangelical Protestants who believe that people are saved not just on faith, but also on works. Many Catholics will say they have to do social justice work. Again, same with Methodists, same with Presbyterians. The faith-based is almost exclusively pretty much in the most majority of cases on a more conservative evangelical form of Protestantism in the world, not just in the US. But like I said, if you belong to the United Methodist Church, that's not an evangelical church, it's a mainline church. And they say, well, yeah, it's great to have faith, but you got to give back to the world. And also, a lot of Reformed Jewish synagogues, I'm not Reform, I should say, but I have been to a Reformed synagogue. Faith is a part of it, but works and doing good and giving back is a big part of the practice as well. So interesting. Not sure how folks get six. Yeah. Oh, sorry. I think I read that one before. Isn't it weird? Isn't ignorance just so dumb when you could just easily research that? Like they're totally different religions, totally different people, different founders, I mean, they have some overlap. As I said, some people will say, "Oh, Sikhism is like Hinduism," and okay, that's a historical thing. But yeah, isn't that odd how first of all, how easy it is to be ignorant, but then how easy it is to not be ignorant. I'm always always interested in that stuff. Okay. So when I was in high school, I guess in like 97, 98, 99. Then anyway, I took an introduction to religious course at my public high school, and we learned about this definition of religion, which is outdated, which was compiled in the 1970s. And the reason why I wanted to do this, to show this, is because this was an attempt by Western scholars to say, well, all of religions have these five things in common. And if we're going to go forth from the 1970s, then a religion has to have all these five things. And I'm going to get into why we don't, we don't think of this now as concrete, and why it's kind of been debunked, and why I put it's outdated. And these were called the five C's of religion. So the first is scholars believed at the time, going back 50 years now plus, that if order to be a religion, a group had to have a creed, which were commonly held beliefs. So an espoused belief in something or a statement of belief, usually about God. They needed a code, so commonly held morals and or restrictions, diet, etc. Kosher diet, don't not eating, not drinking alcohol, etc. Halt, which is a weird one, I know for all of us, but here we're using it as a verb, not a noun. Cult comes from culture, cultivate. In this case, it means to give or to worship or to give reverence to something. Also could be someone or even some place. And then community, there needed to be weekly services, what are called life cycle events. So things like christenings or a birth event for a birth, something like a bar mitzvah or even a funeral or weddings, etc. Life cycle events. And then they needed to have clergy. So they needed to have some kind of ordained congregational leaders. Well, if we look at this list, there are religions that do not have all five. So, for example, I mentioned the Unitarian Universalist and the Ethical Culture Society. They do not have a creed, at least when it comes to God. Yes, they do have their own shared principles, but the, not when it comes to God. So, really, and their code is another thing. Most of these religious humanist groups are not interested if you drink alcohol or what you do or don't eat. So, technically, when it comes to creed, when it comes to code, it's not really well defined. Even worship, because not well defined. They do have community and clergy, though, so they absolutely have at least two, but the other three are a bit muddled. A group like the Rastafarians, they have no place of worship, no houses of worship. Okay, but they have community services, but they don't actually have worship. They're not like a typical organized religion. They gather in people's homes. They have what are called tabernacles. I don't even think they have clergy, right? But they might have creed and code cult, right? If you look at the Baha'i faith has no clergy, but they do have a creed, a code, a cult, a community. So this becomes very, very problematic. And this is another aspect of religion is that religions may overlap, but they don't have a lot in common. I also want to tell people who are in the Scientology criticism in the 1970s. I believe that somebody must have told L. Ron Hubbard that religious scholars now considered these five C's to be what a religion is, because before these five C's, Scientology did not have any of these things. So if you know, there is Ron Hubbard wrote in the 70s, middle to late 70s, he wrote the creed of a Scientologist, the code of a Scientologist. He wrote the eight dynamics, including the eighth dynamic, which is supposed to be supreme being. He also wrote about Sunday services, weddings, and funerals. And of course, back in the 70s, they used to have Scientology reverends that would wear black robes, white priest collars, and have a very large necklace with an eight pointed cross around their neck. That last one I've never seen with my own eyes, but I have only seen them in books. So I think somebody told Hubbard, these are the five characteristics you must have in a religion. And 20 plus years after he started Scientology as a religion, he obviously discovered all of these things. And I don't think it's a coincidence. I think somebody told him, here are the five C's. That's what a religion is. If we have it, then we can become recognized. And he invented it somewhere around 1974, 75, and afterwards. So there you go. Now, what do all religions have in common? Again, it's tough, right? So when we look at all these characteristics, what I want you to note is there will be overlap, but it's not going to be 100%. So when it comes to God or gods, theistic religions have this in common, but non-theistic religions maybe. So, for example, in Mahayana Buddhism, some people say that's polytheistic or folk religion. So, okay, maybe there, but not in Theravada Buddhism or especially Jainism, which flat out deny the existence of a creator. Prayer, okay, yeah, prayer certainly in Christianity. And again, I don't know all Christian views of prayer. Certainly, there are, like in Judaism, you recite prayers from a book. That's what we do in Judaism. When I think of Christian prayer, I think of people, and maybe this is because of popular media and TV. I think of it more like an improvised thing where you sort of put your hands together, you sort of say what's on your mind, and you're sort of speaking directly with God. But in Judaism, we read from a prayer book. So, like, we have a prayer for a meal, which is called a kiddush. We have the prayer for the dead, which is called the Mornis Kaddish. They're all written down, so we don't improvise. That might not be the best term, but bear with me. But we read it because that's our prayer. So we're not like putting our hands in pleading or anything. Not to say that all Christians do that, but that's not what we do. We read. Buddhist prayer is interesting because sometimes they do pray to different devas, and sometimes they do plea in some cases, but not really. They're not praying to the Buddha. They don't pray for enlightenment. They might, pray for something else. So, in Islam, of course, it's more of a ritual as well, where they have full body prostrations. When it comes to rituals, I mean, again, there is a lot of sharing, lighting candles, food and stuff, but they all differ. And then I mentioned houses of worship. Some places are very advertised, like Christian churches and so forth, but Rastafarians and my good friends in the Ismailis, if you ever drive by an Ismaili mosque, there'll be no advertisement, no sign, nothing. Also, in the Druze religion, which is an ethno religion, where the Druze members are actually being attacked right now by Syrian rebels in Syria, but a lot of their organizations have these ethno religions because they don't proselytize. What's the point to advertise? You'll just drive by a building, you won't even know it's a place of worship. And then founders, sure, Christianity has a founder, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism does not have a founder, Shintoism, and all the forms of paganism from the Greeks to the Romans to our First Nations in Canada, they don't have any founders. So, really, the final thing to say is that with religion and religious studies, is really the only takeaway is to say that, well, there's a lot of, that it's complicated and there might be a lot of overlap, but there's a lot of difference. So, again, according to religious studies, all religions have very few things in common. While there is overlap between certain religions, there are many differences. There's no archetype definition of what a religion is. I know that in the Western world, a lot of people, when they say religion, they might mean the Catholic Church. Why? There's over a billion Catholics. They're very much advertised and they're very big. And so when people say, I don't like religion because sometimes they're only really talking about Catholicism, not to say all the time, but sometimes. And so that's why I kind of like religious studies because you have to dig a little deeper when people talk about religion. What are they talking about when they're talking about this entirely huge thing? Do people really know that religion as a modern concept is 150 years old, comes from Europe, and is complicated, right? The final point on this is something that again goes into Scientology, and it's very exclusively American. In the United States of America, you all were founded by religious refugees who were kicked out of England because they were very, very radical, the Puritans. They came and they set up Jamestown and in Virginia and so forth, and committed genocide against your Native American indigenous people. And a lot of groups in the subsequent years, like the Quakers, the Baptists, the Methodists, Amish, Mennonites, Lutherans, and so forth, although many of them have their Baptists have their start in Europe, a lot were able to have a second life in the United States, like the Quakers. They were persecuted in Europe, but then they came to the United States. Even the Baptists, by the way, started in England. And so this is why I think sometimes in the United States there's a taboo on what is and isn't a religion. And so if they say that they're a religion, they're a religion. And this is why I think Scientology can both be a religion, but also be destructive. When people say, is it a religion or is it a cult? It's an old, old way of thinking that goes back to the 70s. You can be both. And I'm saying this as someone that has a religious affiliation. I practice my religion. I'm not preachy. I have quite a liberal, I have a very traditional religious practice, but I have a very liberal interpretation on that because being Jewish, we don't proselytize. I hope that I'm a good example, especially there's a lot of anti-Semitism in the world today. There's a lot of bad things going on in the Middle East. I'm hoping that I can, be a better example. At the same time, right? I'm doing my own thing personally, and I wish more people were like that because when religion gets involved in politics, when it starts telling people what to do, when religions start to make policies, I think it cheapens religion and it only gives ammunition to those who hate religion to hate religion more. And that's a problem to me. And one of the things is with Scientology, yeah, it can be destructive and be a religion. Not all people are going to have a positive religious experience. As I mentioned at the start of this, their experience, their pain, their trauma is valid. And so acknowledging that religions can be both constructive, benign, and destructive is very good. So can political groups, so can social groups, so can businesses. And for that, I would like to point to Steve Hassan, who is a gentleman who is Jewish, by the way, who has a religious affiliation with a synagogue and has this spectrum that it's not about is it religion, is it a cult? We're getting too confused on that. Is it destructive by way? Is it not accountable? Is it abusive? Is it constructive? Is it help? Is it truthful? Is it accountable? Is it just in the middle, which sometimes just means this is nice, but they're not either way. And so that's kind of how I like to look at it. And I am going to stop my slides now. I just want to see here. And again, just say like that's the thing that I want to sort of put forward is to tell people that even religious studies will acknowledge, although there are some people who are really bad scholars who will accept money from groups like Scientology to write dismissive articles. I understand that there's trauma there, but I really, really, really want people to understand it's a very small segment that religious studies and religion is not as simple and not as easy than we think. While it is complicated, it's also not impossible to understand either, right? I'm not saying that there isn't such a thing as a religion. There is. It's just a bit more complicated than we think. Okay. I want to go over here. So again, thank you everybody. I know we've had some comments, so I'm going to read the comments between Pete here and Irish Mart. So Pete says, United States IRS has criteria that must be met to be called a religion. So one of that is that they must prove that no individual is making or profiting from donations. And in the case of Scientology, there's that history with lawsuits and stuff. They also cannot, a religious denomination cannot endorse specific candidates for political office. And if they do, they have to have, like, if they're running for Congress, let's say in a district, a church kind of has to have both of them, which I think is good. Even though they might be like a Southern Baptist church who's like, they're going to vote Republican. If they want to have a debate, they have to have both sides. So they can't, or else they will get their tax exemption revoked. Yep, it's highly flawed criteria when the cult of Scientology is considered a religion. Again, it can be both, but I understand what you mean. I do understand what you mean. I know a Unitarian that lost his high-profile jobs during BLM for stating that all lives matter, every single one. He's still trying to sue. Yep, for losing one of his jobs under the freedom of religion. That's one thing I will say about the Unitarian Universalist. They're very activist based and so social. Like they're not so exclusive when it comes to God or whatever. So you can be an atheist, a Christian, you can be, Jewish, a Muslim, a Hindu, but like and I'm liberal, but they're exclusively kind of liberal. I will also say that the Unitarians are what are called congregationalist, which means that every single congregation is independently operated and autonomous. So some are like more moderate and welcoming of people who might have different political associations, but a lot are like very exclusively progressive. And even I, as someone with center left politics, I consider myself a social democrat. Maybe some people don't like that, which is okay. But even I have a line, is what I'm trying to say. And I like talking to people who are different. Some of these congregations are very, very insular, um, and they're very echo chambery. So that does not surprise me in the least. Perhaps Mark can talk about group auditing. I can do that at another time because that has to do um, with the Sunday service, and my throat is getting a little tickly. I apologize to everybody. But I will talk about that, Peter. I want you to email message me to remind me, because again, we have two more videos that I have PowerPoints of. So maybe in 3 weeks' time, we can do that. Mm. I think the lawyer, excuse me, let me just do one thing here. Sorry. There we go, making it bigger so I can actually read it. I have glasses, which I should wear, and I'm like, I don't. Let's see here. Where is this one? So I think the lawyers that were hired after Hubbard died in 86 and 93 were more instrumental in helping DM David Miscavige make changes to protect the money grubbing lawyers. Yep. Oh, yes. You're absolutely correct. Oh, that's really interesting, Peter. I found that the BML thing a trigger for me as I wholesomely agree that all lives matter, every single one. I will say with BLM, guys, as I have gone back and forth with that. Why they say Black Lives Matter is because and again, you wanna disagree with this is totally fine, but this is me saying their side of the fact, was that in America, there were a lot of high profile cases of cops killing black men and women. So when they say all Black lives matter, they're not talking exclusively that only Black lives matter. They were saying that Black lives matter in policing because many of them were being killed. Now you could say, "Hey, and shouldn't all lives matter or whatever?" But the whole point of that was a specific, um, activist group, specifically of police targeting Black Americans. So that's why they're saying Black lives matter. They're not saying all lives don't matter. I will say that the All Lives Matter movement was trying in a well-intentioned, very well intentioned, we're trying to take away from the idea of police killing black people. And I'm not a statistics person, so was there it's beyond my skill. But I'm just trying to say from what I've heard is that it was specifically about young black men and women being killed by the police, and that's why they called it that. You do with it what you want. I'm just paraphrasing here. Don't shoot the messenger. Um, so BLM was an activist group trying to emphasize, yeah, the deaths of black and brown people in America, thus de-emphasizing it was triggering. Yeah, okay, there you go. I should read. I should read before I editorialize. It was a badly named group. Yeah. Another found. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. There was division. I agree with you that. Most of the groups like this, I remember Occupy Wall Street that just imploded. BLM. You know, problem with BLM in Toronto was that the people who ran BLM were communist Marxist revolutionaries, and whenever they would start a meeting, they would say "Hello, comrades," and that was triggering for a lot of people. And that is another thing that when a movement that I think has really good intentions, like Black Lives Matter. Hey, let's try to help out, save the lives of Black men and women who are, in their view, being unjustly killed by the police. But then you have like communist revolutionaries, like taking over and calling people comrade, like me as someone who, you know, let's just put it that way. If you've seen my Yugoslavia video, you'll understand why I was a bit skeptical. Um, let's see here. Yeah, Sprint favor, wanted money, etc. Marv, okay. Marv, it has been a little while. Greetings from Berlin. Ja, willkommen. It's good to see you and hear you again. Greetings from Berlin. That's amazing. When we talk about Scientology, I wish to study comparative religious studies. LOL. A normal wish for a 15-year-old boy. Is that all you are, Marv? 15? Or was that back in the day? Oh, it might have been back in the day. Hey, Marv. Um, it's interesting. Readers. I don't. Yeah, yeah. I don't know about y'all. I'm a hard copy person. I can't do Kindles. I can barely read on screens like this. I need a hard copy. I'm sure I'm not the old man, the only old man or old woman here, the fogey who likes it that way. Oh, yes, when we talked about it when you were at school. Obviously, you're not 15 anymore, are you, Marv? Joe Ducepo, you have graced us with your presence. Exalted Mark Postle, number two. Number one was here earlier, Irish and Shell and Peter, I think all except Huckleberry. So the majority of my Mark Postles, when we all come together, it's going to be like a Transformers, you know what I mean, or the Power Rangers. Do you remember that one, guys? Or the Thunderbirds? When all the Mark Postles get together, we're going to evolve into an angelic being. But that the world is not ready for that. So that's okay to only have five of our six. That's totally okay. The world is not ready. But thank you, Joe. Uh, let me know if you went to your little concert thing before. I'm always interested in that. Jo is here gracing us with her presence. Um, Yeah, I'm not 15 anymore. I haven't been 15 for a while, let's put it that way. Yep, Mark Possel reporting. You got it, Joe. Did you know when you were in Berlin that Scientology is watched? Yeah, no, we yeah, yes. Scientologists, Marv, are some of the most paranoid people in the world. Don't know if you know that. If you didn't know that before, you know that now. They're incredibly paranoid, sometimes without concern. In this case, yeah, we knew all the time, and we even had journalists about. Just before I left, we had this guy named Freddie Gareitz, who was a journalist, and I can't remember if that's the alias or his actual name. And he was an undercover journalist, and he came, and I remember meeting him and selling him a course. So we had a couple journalists come undercover as well. Looks like I growing a beard. I have my creams, injections. I got some spots here that aren't going in, but yes, my creams. I do 2 creams a day from the Dermo. I've got some alopecia or dysplasia here, still in here, but they're putting in some cortisone or something like this for hair growth, and then I go back in about a month to look at it. But you can't see it, but on my left side, up here, my sideburn, which then goes down to a beard, the cream has actually thickened it, which is really nice, and also down here, which is also the side that usually doesn't have as much. We have more alopecia here or dysplasia. So anyway, it's doing okay. I hope to one day have one of those big bushy Orthodox beards. So if Hashem wills it, I will. Went to the concert, just got back home again. Whenever you want, no rush. Tell me how it is, and if you had any food, any good food, let me know. Okay, it's been about an hour and a half. Thank you everybody for being here. As I said, my plan for next week is to talk about the history of Romania in the 20th century. I'm going to talk about some of the kings. Now, I know Joe and Chad, you have been present 2 years ago for a lot of these. Obviously, if you have time, I would love for you to come back, even though this is a review. I don't even know if you remember us doing this on the Nerdy Bunch, but I hope you do. Hope that you all enjoyed it. I'm glad to have Marv here. This is really great that you're here, Irish. Um, Peter, you're the best. Irish, you're amazing. Keep protesting, keep being safe when you protest. Shell, again, you're amazing. And thank you, Clearwater Chad. Joe, again, thank you for gracing us with your presence. It's always a pleasure. Um, uh, yeah, extreme paranoia. Um, yeah, and also, by the way, just one more thing was we actually had I shared this uh, I can't remember, but I shared this um, sometime. Maybe it was with the Nerdy Bunch, maybe it was before. We had an immigration officer actually come to the org, and they shoot me off as I was in Treasury. They shoot me up to the academy and whatever. There's a whole story about illegal work, people working illegally without any visas and stuff is a disaster. And yes, a lot has gone on in Romania in the last 2 years. I will see what I can do with the new. They had some new elections and stuff like this, but I will be talking about all of those things next week. So thank you, everybody. If you have not liked this video, please do so. It helps me out. If you haven't yet subscribed to my channel, I think we all have here. But if you're watching on the replay and you haven't, that as well. If you have any, free time or moments or something, I have made playlists. And I would really love it if you could click one of my playlists. And if you have the time, you have the data or the data wherever you're from to watch it on the internet, please, let it run, watch some stuff. I'm at 500 500 more watch hours. So I've done about 100 watch hours just recently, about 500 more to 4,000, which would get me monetized. I'm still at about 1,200 subscribers, so I still want to grow. And absolutely. Same with you, Joe. Thank you, Joe. And Marv, absolutely. Thank you so much. Um, Again, please help me out, channel as much as you can. I will be back next week with the history of Romania. The week after, we're going to do theology, theological perspectives, and stuff like that. And then after that, I think again we'll talk about Scientology. I want to talk about my thesis, and I got a lot more to come. So thank you for joining me this Saturday evening. And in case I don't see you, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night. Thank you, Joe.